Hallelujah. Shalom, shalom, Mishpachah. Greetings to the 12 tribes of Yisrael scattered abroad. In this video, we're going to talk about the timeline of the Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread, Pesach, and Chag HaMatzot in the New Testament, and how the events of Yahushua HaMashiach, when he went to Jerusalem, fall in line with the feast day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Luke chapter 22. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover. So we need to understand that over time, Chag HaMatzot, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, became known also as the Feast of Passover. Of course, the Passover lamb, or the Pesach lamb, is an integral part of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So just like the memorial of Hanukkah, or the memorial of dedication, later on eventually became known as the memorial of lights. So we need to really remember that literally the Passover, or the Pesach, is the name of the lamb that is sacrificed on the 14th day of Abib, going into the evening. Mark chapter 14. After 2 days was the feast of the Passover and of unleavened bread, and the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by craft and put him to death. So depending on your translation that you have, you will see that the feast of is italicized, which means that in the original, or in the Greek, those words are not there. The feast of was added by the translators. So really, it should say, after 2 days was the Passover. So for those of us in the diaspora who were raised in Christian philosophy, we remember, before we return to the ancient pathways, that, for example, when we used to talk about Christmas, we would talk about Christmas time or Christmas season, which we would really begin after Thanksgiving, but actually the day of Christmas was December 25, but the whole season of Christmas was Christmas time. So we see the same kind of idea here, that unleavened bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, began on the 15th day of Abib until the 21st day of Abib. But there was a season or time of unleavened bread where they would begin the preparations of the Pesach sacrifice and preparing for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Yehuchanan, or John chapter 11. And the Yahudim's Passover was nigh at hand, and many went out of the country up to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. The Passover is a sacrifice, and according to the Torah, according to Hebrew custom, in order to sacrifice an animal, the the person doing the sacrifice must be ceremonially clean and must go through a purification or sanctification called a mikvah or a baptism. And the people who partake in eating the sacrifice must also sanctify or purify themselves before they eat of the flesh of the sacrifice. Then Yahusha 6 days before the Passover came to Bethany, where Eleazar was which had been dead, whom he raised from the dead. On the next day, much people that were come to the feast, when they heard that Yahusha was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees, and went forth to meet him, and cried, Hoshiana! Blessed is the King of Yisrael that comes in the name of Yahuwah. So we see that the triumphal entry of Yahusha coming into Jerusalem on the donkey was 5 days before the feast of unleavened bread, the 10th day of Abib, the same day that the Israelites are to select a lamb of the first year that is unblemished. This is the same day that Yahusha made his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. So that idea of Palm Sunday is not a thing. Luke chapter 22. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Kepha and Yehuchanan, saying, Go and prepare us the Passover that we may eat. And they said unto him, Where will you that we prepare? And he said unto them, Behold, when you are entered into the city, there shall a man meet you, bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house where he enters in. And you shall say unto the good man of the house, The master says unto you, Where is the guest chamber, where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? And he shall show you a large upper room furnished. There make ready. And they went and found as he had said unto them, and they made ready the Passover. So when it talks about the day when the Passover must be killed, that is the 14th day of Abib. The Passover lambs are killed towards the end of the 14th day of Abib, going into the evening. Mark chapter 14. And the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said unto him, Where will you that we go and prepare that you may eat the Passover? And his disciples went forth and came into the city, and found as he had said unto them, and they made ready the Passover. So again, this is where we see the 14th day of Abib, where they're getting ready to sacrifice the Passover lambs. They're making ready for the Passover. They're making preparations. And they're not eating the Passover meal just yet. They are making preparations to eat the Passover lamb. Matthew chapter 26. Now the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yahusha, saying unto him, Where will you that we prepare for you to eat the Passover? And he said, Go into the city to such a man, and say unto him, The master says, My time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Yahusha had appointed them, and they made ready the Passover. So again, remember, literally, the Passover is the lamb that will be sacrificed towards the end of the 14th day of Abib. So when they're making ready the Passover, they're making ready the lamb. Luke chapter 22. And when the hour was come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. And he said unto them, With desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say unto you, I will not any more eat thereof, until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of Elohim. And this is a quote that many people get confused over, and they confuse the Last Supper or the Master's Supper with the actual Passover meal, which is eaten the night of the 15th day of Abib. This is not the Passover meal where the Passover lamb is eaten with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. This is the night before the Passover meal. And Yahushua says, with desire, I have desired to eat this Passover. In other words, I had wanted to eat this Passover with you. But we will see as we continue on that the time that Yahushua was nailed to the tree is the same time that the Passover lambs were being sacrificed. And the time that he was laid into the tomb, that night after he was put into the tomb, was the night where they actually ate the Passover meal. So the Last Supper or the Master's Supper is not the Passover meal. Yehuchanan chapter 13. Now before the feast of Passover, when Yahushua knew that his hour was come that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Yehuda Iscariot, Shimeon's son, to betray him. So again, we see before the feast of the Passover, before the feast of unleavened bread, this happened. So this is the night of the 14th day of Abib. So the Last Supper or the Master's Supper was not the meal of the Passover lamb with the bitter herbs and unleavened bread. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. For I have received of the Master that which also I delivered unto you, that the Master Yahushua the same night in which he was betrayed took bread, and when he had given thanks he brake it, and said, Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner also he took the cup, when he had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do you, as oft as you drink it, in remembrance of me. We see here that Shaul or Paul confirms that the Master's Supper or the Last Supper was the dinner of the night when he was betrayed, which was the night of the 14th day of Abib. The Master's Supper is not the Passover meal. The Passover meal is eaten at dinner time the night of the 15th day of Abib. And we can see here that when he speaks of the Lord's Supper, the Master's Supper, that Shaul mentions nothing about the Passover lamb, and he mentions nothing about unleavened bread, because he did not associate the Last Supper with the Passover meal. Yehuchanan chapter 13. Yahushua answered, He it is to whom I shall give a sop, when I have dipped it. And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Yehuda Iscariot, the son of Shimeon. And after the sop, Shaitan entered into him. Then said Yahushua unto him, That you do quickly. Now no man at the table knew for what intent he spake this unto him. For some of them thought, because Yehuda had the bag, that Yahusha had said unto him, Buy those things that we have need of against the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. He then, having received the sop, went immediately out, and it was night. So again, we see that this Last Supper was not the Passover meal, because we understand that the 15th day of Abib is a high Sabbath. So there is no reason for the disciples to think that Yehuda or Judas was going to go and buy things that they needed for the feast, because on a high Sabbath there is no buying or selling. Luke chapter 22, verse 54. Then took they him, and led him, and brought him into the high priest's house, and Kepha followed afar off. Verse 61. And the master turned and looked upon Kepha, and Kepha remembered the word of the master, how he had said unto him, Before the cock crow, you shall deny me thrice. Verse 66. And as soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together and led him into their council, saying, Okay, so here we see that after Yahushua was arrested, early in the morning, he was already put on trial, being questioned at the high priest's house. So we see the events of what happened to Yahushua on the 14th day of Abib. The night, at the beginning of the day, 14th day of Abib, they had the Last Supper. And the Last Supper was not the Passover meal. After their supper, they went and sung hymns, going to the Mount of Olives. After that, they went to Gethsemane, where Yahushua prayed, and that is where Yahushua was arrested. And before morning dawned on the 14th day of Abib, he was already taken to the high priest to be tried and questioned. And early in the morning, they delivered him to the Roman representative Pilate. Yehuchanan, or John, chapter 18. Then led they Yahushua from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate says unto them, What is truth? When he had said this, he went out again unto the Yahudim, and said unto them, I find in him no fault at all. So again, we see that early in the morning, Yahushua was brought to the Roman representative Pilate. And we see that the Yahudim did not enter into his residence, the hall of judgment, because they did not want to be made unclean. Why? Because they wanted to eat the Passover meal. And again, remember that the Passover lamb is a sacrifice. An unclean person is not allowed to eat a sacrifice unto Yahuwah. So we see that the Last Supper was not the Passover meal. And we see that Pilate said unto them, What is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again unto the Yahudim. So the Yahudim were waiting outside Pilate's residence. because Pilate was a foreigner. He was not a keeper of the Torah. He was not a proselyte. He was not a convert to following the Torah. So the Yahudim did not enter into his residence because there's no knowing what they might touch or what might come in contact with them that would make them ceremonially unclean, and therefore they would not be able to partake in the Passover meal. Yehukanan chapter 18. But you have a custom that I should release unto you one at the Passover. Will you therefore that I release unto you the king of the Yahudim? Then cried they all again, saying, Not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. Luke chapter 23. For of necessity he must release one unto them at the feast. And they cried out all at once, saying, Away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas. So again, this is happening on the 14th day of Abib, before the 15th day of Abib, where the Passover meal is actually eaten at night. Yehukanan chapter 19. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Yahusha forth, and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. And it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he says unto the Jews, Behold your king. But they cried out, Away with him, crucify him. Pilate says unto them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. So again, we see that it was the preparation of the Passover. What is the Passover? The Passover is the lamb that is sacrificed towards the end of the 14th day of Abib, going into the evening. And it says that it was the 6th hour. The 6th hour is noon. So we know that at noon, the sun is at its highest point. And after noon, the sun starts going down. So that is the time that the Yahudim begin killing the Passovers as the 14th day of Abib goes into its end. Yehukanan chapter 19. And it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said unto the Yahudim, Behold your king. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened, for even Mashiach our Passover is sacrificed for us. So we have an understanding from Shaul or Paul that Yahusha was nailed to the stake at the same time that the Passover lambs were being slaughtered on the 14th day of Abib, going into the evening. Mark 15. And when the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. So again, the 6th hour is noon. The 9th hour is about 3 o'clock p.m. Matthew 27. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. Luke chapter 23. And it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. So again, going into the evening, the same time that Yahusha HaMashiach was nailed to the stake was the same time that the lambs were being slaughtered for the Pasach sacrifice. Yehukanan chapter 19. The Yahudim therefore, because it was the preparation, that the bodies should not remain upon the stake on the Sabbath day, for that Sabbath day was a high day, besought Pilate that their legs might be broken, and that they might be taken away. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein was never a man yet laid. There laid they Yahusha, therefore because of the Yahudim's preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. So again, we see that the time that Yahusha was nailed to the stake was the preparation, the time when they were slaughtering the Passover lambs. And they had to take down the bodies from the stakes because evening was coming. And at sunset was the beginning of the Sabbath, the high Sabbath, the first day of unleavened bread. Mark 15. And now when the even was come, because it was the preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Yusuf of Arimathea, an honorable counselor, which also waited for the kingdom of Elohim, came and went in boldly unto Pilate and craved the body of Yahusha. So again, after Yahusha died on the stake, which was the day of the preparation, the day that they were slaughtering the Passover lambs, was the day before the Sabbath. The 15th day of Abib, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is a high Sabbath. And the night of the 15th day of Abib is when the lambs that were sacrificed were actually eaten with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. Luke chapter 23. And he took it down and wrapped it in linen and laid it in a sepulchre that was hewn in stone, wherein never man before was laid. And that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. And the women also which came with him from Galilee followed after and beheld the sepulchre and how his body was laid. And they returned and prepared spices and ointments, and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. Again, the preparation day, the 14th day of Abib, and it talks about at the evening, towards sunset, and the Sabbath drew on, the high Sabbath, the first day of unleavened bread, the 15th day of Abib. Matthew chapter 12. For as Una was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Chapter 20. And Yahusha, going up to Jerusalem, took the 12 disciples apart in the way, and said unto them, Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be betrayed unto the chief priests and unto the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death, and shall deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify him, and the 3rd day he shall rise again. So again, Yahusha said that he would be in the grave 3 days. Matthew chapter 27. Now the next day that followed the day of the preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees came together unto Pilate, saying, Sir, we remember that deceiver said, while he was yet alive, After 3 days I will rise again. Command therefore that the sepulchre be made sure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say unto the people, He is risen from the dead. So the last error shall be worse than the first. So again, this is the day after the preparation, the 15th day of Abib, the first day of unleavened bread. And again we see that Yahusha said that he would be in the grave 3 days. Luke chapter 24. saying, "The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful man and be crucified, and the third day rise again." Verse 46, and said unto them, "Thus it is written, and thus it behooved Mashiach to suffer, and to rise from the dead the third day." Mark chapter 16. And when the Sabbath day was past, Miriam Magdalene and Miriam the mother of Jacob and Salama had bought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. Now when Yahushua was risen early the first day of the week, he appeared first to Miriam Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 devils. So again, depending on your translation, you will see that certain words are italicized. The italicized words are added by the translators. They are not there in the Greek. So when we read verse 9 about Yahushua, it seems that Yahushua rose up on the first day of the week, so-called Resurrection Sunday. But we will see that this is incorrect, and this is not the correct translation of verse 9. So again, now when Yahushua was risen early the first day of the week, he appeared first to Miriam Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 devils. So when we go back to the Greek, we see that Yahushua, his name is not there. So actually how this verse should have been translated into the English is, "Now having risen early the first of the week, he appeared first to Miriam Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons." So before the first day of the week, Yahushua had already risen. So Resurrection Sunday is not a thing. It is not biblical. Matthew chapter 28. In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Miriam Magdalene and the other Miriam to see the sepulchre. So we see that when the Miriams came to see the body of Yahushua, Yahushua had already risen before the first day of the week. Luke chapter 24. Now upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came unto the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them. And they found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre, and they entered in and found not the body of the Master Yahushua. Yochanan chapter 20. The first day of the week comes Miriam Magdalene early, when it was yet dark, unto the sepulchre, and sees the stone taken away from the sepulchre. When the Miriams came to the gravesite, to the tomb, they did not find the body of Yahushua, because Yahushua had already risen. And we see that they came to the tomb very early the first day, before the sun had even risen. While it was still dark, they found that Yahushua was not there.
According to the Parashim, or the Pharisees, the first fruits of the barley harvest was to be presented on the 16th day of Abib, and the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot, was to be observed on the 6th day of Sivan. And the teachings of the Pharisees is what rabbinic or Talmudic Judaism, modern Judaism, follows today. So if you are following a Jewish calendar, this is what is presented on the Jewish calendar. However, the Sadducees or the Sadducees were the ones that had the authority in the temple service in the first century. This is the time of the ministry of Yahushua Mashiach and his disciples. And according to the Sadducees, the first fruits was to be offered on the first day of the week after the weekly Shabbat, which followed the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But now is Mashiach risen from the dead, and become the firstfruits of them that slept. For since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Mashiach shall all be made alive. By every man in his own order, Mashiach the firstfruits, afterward they that are Mashiach's at his coming. So we see that even though Shaul or Paul was a Pharisee, he reveals that Mashiach rose from the dead after the weekly Shabbat on the day of first fruits.
So when we look at the timeline of the events of what's called the New Testament in the Gospels, we see that the 10th day of Abib, when the Israelites were to select the Passover lambs, males of the first year without blemish, was the same time that Yahushua made his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And of course, this was the time that the Israelites made their pilgrimage into Jerusalem in preparation of the Passover sacrifice and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. These were the days of purification, where they would do a mikvah to sanctify themselves. On the 14th day of Abib at night was the Last Supper, or the Master's Supper, and after that he was betrayed. In the daytime, at noon, when the Passover lambs were being sacrificed, going into the evening toward the end of the 14th day, was the same time that Yahushua was nailed to the stake. This was the preparation day. So he was laid in the tomb towards the end of the 14th day. And when the sun set, that was the beginning of the high Sabbath. That dinner was when the Passover lambs were actually eaten with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. So the Master's Supper, the Last Supper, was not the Passover meal. We see that the 15th day was the high Sabbath, and this was the beginning of the 3 days and 3 nights of Yahushua being in the grave. And then we have, after the high Sabbath of the 15th day, the first day of unleavened bread, you have on the 17th day the weekly Sabbath, the 7th day of the week. And at the end of the weekly Sabbath was when Yahushua arose from the tomb. So when the Miriams came to the tomb early on the 18th day, the first day of the week, before the sun had risen, they found that the tomb was already empty. And that is the day that Yahushua appeared to his disciples. And of course, on the 21st day was another high Sabbath, the end of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So I hope that this explanation was helpful for you to be able to put the events of Yahusha in the Gospels in order according to the rehearsal of the Passover sacrifice and the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Fear Elohim and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Bind up the testimony, seal the Torah among my disciples. Shalom, family. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to click the subscribe button. Like, comment, and share.